believe that the option of using parks, golf courses, trails, and open spaces as temporary shelter sites is an appropriate solution. Parks and open spaces are one of the bright spots in Portland. They work, and they are a jewel, a defining characteristic that Portland is admired for. Our parks are well used and well loved by a broad spectrum of our over 665,000 citizens, a melting pot that brings together Portlanders of all socioeconomic backgrounds. They are not meant to be used as residential spaces. They are meant to be used as places of recreation and respite, safe, clean, and available to all. On the Portland Parks Foundation, we support opportunities for all Portlanders, whether housed or houseless, to gather in parks. From providing funds for walking tours for Somali emigres, to raising money to feed kids in parks and support summer free-for-all programming, to providing play equipment and other amenities in parks and neighborhoods, our goal is to ensure equitable access and opportunities for all. To saddle parks and open spaces with a role as part of the solution to houselessness is short-sighted and represents short-term wishful thinking. It is simply not viable. It is not a compassionate solution for the houseless. It could disproportionately affect North and East Portland due to the existence of underdeveloped parks lands. It is not fair to the rest of Portland citizens to deny them easy, clean, and safe access to their treasured and much needed green spaces. And it is wrong to needlessly endanger the health of these environmentally sensitive zones. Your own BPS staff states that there is adequate city-owned land to accomplish your goals without using parks and open spaces. Portlanders passed 2 levies in recent years, one to support the houseless and one to support parks. We need to honor both. Please do not make parks and open spaces any part of the solution for the troubling issue of houselessness. Thank you.
Next up, we have Zari Santner. Zari, are you able to unmute? Why don't we go to Paul Agramus and then we'll come back to Zari.
Good afternoon, Mayor Wheeler and City Council. Thank you. I'm the chair of the Portland Parks Board, but my comments today are my own. Thank you for considering steps to address our houseless crisis. The proposed ordinance change to permit camping in open space is a well-intentioned step for safe housing for our houseless neighbors that is not completely thought out. And I'm urging you not to make this change without amendment to protect parks and natural areas. The city has a covenant with voters to reduce houselessness and to increase access to critical green infrastructure in parks, natural areas, and community centers. Open space is not necessarily vacant space and should not be treated that way, which this proposed ordinance change would effectively do. Declaring open space available for camping will unintentionally degrade vital park resources and likely result in more people living in squalor, as is currently happening in open spaces across the city. What is lacking is a well-developed strategy for how the region will turn the houselessness issue around with milestones for 5 years, 10 years, and longer. Housing locations for our unsheltered neighbors need to be distributed across the city in relation to demand where appropriately support facilities exist. We must solve this problem knowing that the long-term solution is many years and decades away if we have a well-developed strategy that is well implemented to provide shelter. Allowing people to camp in open spaces for 180 days with renewals is not a short-term or well-developed bridge strategy. Please do not approve the proposed ordinance change without clear protection for parks and natural areas. Thank you very much.
Next up, we have Zari Santner.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. I apologize for the delay. Good afternoon, Mayor and Commissioners. My name is Zari Santner. I'm the former director of Portland Parks, an engaged member of the Parks Foundation, a grandmother of young Portlanders, and while I have lived and worked in the city for more than 40 years, I'm an immigrant to this country. I sincerely applaud the collaborative efforts that have led to the proposal before you today. While I support many of its recommendations, I cannot support the use of parks, trails, golf courses, and natural areas for temporary camping or group shelters without an emergency declaration by the City Council, given the availability of ample vacant and underutilized sites throughout our city. The intent of this proposal is compassionate, but allowing temporary group camping and shelters in public open spaces without a massive commitment of funding and staffing to keep them clean and safe is neither compassionate nor safe for houseless people. It will also remove the use of a specific site within a park from its intended recreational use by everyone else. Over the past 3 decades, Portland voters have consistently approved tax measures to address inequities in access to the city's park system. At the same time, increasingly, Portland residents, especially its immigrant and BIPOC communities, live in spaces with no yard or outdoor areas. If parks and open spaces become sanctioned as locations for temporary camping and group shelters, the impact will be mostly borne by areas of the city with most diverse demographic groups, with high concentration of BIPOC communities and those that are already park and natural area deficient. This is in direct conflict with the diversity, equity, and inclusion goals adopted by City Council and places at risk the city's most treasured assets belonging to all of its citizens. I urge you to remove the open space zones from consideration for either temporary or permanent houseless shelters. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Zari. I appreciate it. And as always, thanks for your service, and I appreciate your perspective. Since there's a lot of people testifying on this point, I think it's worth it for me just to inject for 45 seconds here what the intent of this is. So areas zoned open space includes natural areas, but it also includes park buildings, parking lots, and other developed landscapes. Open lots, parking, and publicly owned buildings are often appropriate for temporary shelters. And in fact, under the current declared COVID emergency, we're using 2 parks buildings just for that purpose. Wetlands, stream banks, and habitat areas are not appropriate for temporary houseless shelters, and we would not be intentionally using those for shelters on the part of the city. However, we also know that houseless people currently do use these areas for sheltering because, frankly, they have nowhere else to go. So part of what we're trying to do here is to create some more appropriate areas for people to be able to go. There could be limited circumstances where appropriate open space areas might work for shelter. If that were the case, we might actually be in a position where we're protecting more ecologically sensitive areas or areas with a higher public value from destruction. So I want to put that nuance out there, and I appreciate the testimony, and I think it's really important because my suspicion is as we get into the discussion next week and some of the conversations, this is going to be a key point. But I felt it was really important to put the intent of this ordinance out there clearly for everybody to hear. And I appreciate your forbearance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Zari. Appreciate it.
Yes.
Next up, we have Jim Gardner, Sean Sweat, and Linda Robinson. Jim, are you able to unmute? Why don't we go to Sean Sweat and we'll come back to Jim.
All right, thank you. Hello, my name is Sean Sweat. This is the first time I've ever testified at council, and I strongly support this housing continuum project. Other cities, I mean, other cities talk a lot about things like climate change and safe streets and addressing their housing crises, but Portland has a reputation for actually doing something about it. Portland has a reputation for actually leading on many of these issues, and that's why I'm proud to be a Portlander. So I know we all know that we need to make housing of all types and sizes easier to create, and this is one part of what that looks like. And along the same vein, we also know the houseless members of our community need help, and this is one part of helping them. So I hope you'll pass this common sense text amendment so we can continue being a city that leads through crisis while others are just talking. And I've also heard a couple of the amendments that the Neighbors Welcome Group are proposing, and they all sound like positive, thoughtful, reasonable ideas. So I hope the council will look at adding those maybe in next week's meeting that it sounds like will be happening. And lastly, I was also going to mention, like the mayor just mentioned, that there are plenty of open spaces that are not parks and natural areas. So those need to be on the table. So I just wanted to add that too. Thank you, and thanks for all the work you're doing for our Portlanders who need housing.
Let's try Jim Gardner again.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor and Commissioners. My name is Jim Gardner. I believe that most provisions of the shelter to housing continuum represent good public policy, and I support its passage. But I speak to you today about only one aspect of the measure, the provision that would allow so-called temporary shelters in parks and along trails. One of this idea's many problems is that temporary is not really temporary. Portland Parks has a long history of things being put in them on a temporary basis that then remain so long that they become normalized and they end up permanent. For just one example of this, look to the so-called construction parking lot next to the Children's Museum in Washington Park. In the case of shelters being considered here, no reasonable person could possibly believe that they will be there only for a short period of time. Even the language describing the temporary activities allowed in the case of an emergency shelter states that these activities can continue for the length of the emergency.
Exactly.
As you've heard many times, Portland's housing emergency continues to this day for 6 years after it was declared, and it will surely be extended. Dealing with the crisis of homelessness is a long-term problem that needs policies that produce permanent solutions. Allowing shelters in parks and along trails just moves the problem out of sight and helps our city avoid measures that are more effective. Does this mean that we have no compassion for the homeless if we don't embrace allowing shelters in parks? Not at all. These are not mutually exclusive ideas. Any crisis generates many ideas to fix a problem, but thoughtful minds do not necessarily have to embrace every one of them, but instead should determine which make sense and which do not. Allowing shelters in parks is one idea that would cause far more harm than benefit. Thank you.
Next up, we have Linda Robinson.
Yes, my name's Linda Robinson. I'm a longtime advocate for parks and for East Portland. And I support many, in fact, most of the provisions of the measure you're looking at. My biggest concern, however, relates to the prospect of having, quote, temporary outdoor shelters in parks. I appreciate the mayor's comments that that is not the intent of these changes. However, there's nothing in the wording of this code changes that would prohibit it, and it's sure to happen if it's not there. There needs to be some change in that wording that makes it clear that parks, trails, natural areas, golf courses are not intended and are not appropriate for these outdoor shelters. And I would include in that the undeveloped or yet to be developed parks in East Portland. We have a number of them that are still waiting to be developed. They don't have a lot in them, but they are used. And in particular, they are used by a lot of our immigrant population who live in multi-housing dwelling and have no other place to recreate or to have a respite from the hardscape of the city. So that's important to change the wording of that. The other thing is I'd like you to avoid or to use as little as possible outdoor tent type shelter without providing things like, well, in addition to a toilet, and trash, which are absolutely minimum, they really need some heat. They need a way to prepare food. They even need the possibility of how would they acquire food. They need a place to shower. They need a place to clean their clothes. These are important in order to have it a humane place. So please, if you have them outside, have as few as possible and arrange to have these services provided in some way. Thank you.
Next up, we have Michael Tillett, Steve Bozzone, and Jim Owens.
My name is Paddy Tillett. I am a member of the Parks Board, though I'm speaking on my own behalf today. Many employers are worried about burnout amongst those who work from home in apartments and condos for a year with no private open space. For them, getting out into the park is essential to their well-being, to their sanity. For the past year especially, Portland's green infrastructure has proved to be one of its most treasured assets for thousands of us. Public parks can fill this vital citywide need for respite and from working at home because they're safe and companionable places. And for most Portlanders, there's a park just a short walk from home. To allow even temporary homeless encampments in public parks would be to drive away many of those needful citizens. Some camps are tidy and respectful, most are not, prompting people to give them a wide berth. BPS's buildable lands inventory has demonstrated that there's sufficient land for immediate accommodation of the homeless without compromising public parks. Many of those sites are close to services that the houseless need. Finding safe places for the houseless, both in the short and long terms, is vitally important, as signaled by voters willing to tax themselves to do so. Welfare of our citizens is important too, many of whom rely on parks to relax or exercise out of doors. That a majority voted in favor of the parks levy in November is a measure of the importance of parks to our quality of life. Camping in our parks would dramatically increase the need for maintenance, not just for cleanup, but replacement of plants, restoring compacted soils, repairing physical damage to trees and structures. As you know, unfunded deferred maintenance in our parks already exceeds $500,000. There are no funds to enable Portland Parks and Recreation to undertake any additional maintenance, so our parks would remain disfigured for years to come. Although motivated by the best of humane instincts, enabling temporary housing in our parks would effectively deny access to many regular park users and would impose significant unfunded costs, resulting in deterioration of parks that is likely to remain unaddressed for years. Another solution is at hand, as the BPS inventory has demonstrated. Please protect our green infrastructure and instead use undeveloped land close to the services that are so necessary to those trying to return to permanent homes as fully functional members of our community. Please do not sanction camps or shelters within the boundaries of public parks. Thank you very much.
Next up, we have Steve Bozzone.
Hello, commissioners. My name is Steve Bozzone, and I live in Northeast Portland. In my spare time, I join with a network of volunteers who provide mutual aid to our neighbors living outside. We source basic survival materials and distribute them directly to our neighbors so they can survive the elements and hopefully experience a level of dignity day to day. We try to help meet their needs where they are. I speak for myself and my experience and enthusiastically support the shelter to housing continuum. You have heard many great reasons to support this effort. I'll use my time to share a brief story about a houseless neighbor I recently met during the recent winter storm. We'll call him Roger. On a night of icy winds, I found Roger sleeping in a torn tent with no sleeping bag or warm clothes near the Max tracks. He was confused and scared, visibly shaking. As my partner poured hot tea and readied supplies, Roger was on the verge of tears as he shared that most of his cold weather gear was taken during a recent sweep. Roger lost his sleeping bag, winter coat, gloves, hat, and most of his possessions. Roger lost his tools for survival in an instant, just before the cold winds and snow would set in for the long, brutal weekend. While we did what we could for Roger that night, I have not been able to stop thinking about him. Roger's experience is unfortunately all too common, as we've heard during heartbreaking testimonies today. We have to do better for Roger. We have to help stabilize his living conditions without relying on the current status quo of sweeps and exclusionary policies. I've sat here and listened to some testify that the sight of folks living outside is unacceptable and offensive to them. When I consider their complaints alongside my neighbors like Roger, who is forced to rebuild his life every few weeks as he has his possessions stolen or swept, who faces trauma after trauma, indignity after indignity, I'm quite offended that we would center those concerns over Roger. The shelter to housing continuum is a major step in the right direction. Let's give Roger a fighting chance. We need the flexibility this effort provides. Let's normalize welcoming our houseless neighbors and taking care of them. Yes, to shelter to housing continuum. Thank you.
Next up, we have Jim Owens. Jim, are you able to unmute? We can call the next three and then check back in with Jim. Next up, we have David Binnig, followed by Danielle Maillard and Robert Schultz.
Hello, thank you. I'm David Binnig, and I've read a lot of the testimony against this project, and a lot of it I know expresses frustration with the visibility of homelessness in Portland and urges the council to oppose the project on that basis. I know the commissioners understand this, but I want to emphasize how backwards that is. You can't eliminate people's need for shelter by outlawing the shelter that they need. And if we are frustrated that people are sleeping in the street, we need to be able to give them a better option. So I strongly support this project because it would do that, both in expanding the city's options for temporary outdoor shelters. I also think some of the best aspects of it are the ways it would remove barriers to longer-term housing, simplifying the rules around group living arrangements, and allowing tiny houses on wheels where people want to host them. This would both give the city more tools to provide safe shelter, and just as important, make sure that city rules aren't setting up unnecessary barriers to people finding housing. With that in mind, I hope the City Council will pass this proposal, expand it by allowing churches and other religious or community organizations to host shelters without conditional use review. If those organizations are trying to help, I don't want the city to be keeping them from doing so. And I know we've heard a lot about concerns around the use of city parks, but I hope that the city will maintain the possibility of siting shelters in parking lots, rights of way, and other less sensitive open space land. Thank you.
Next up, we have Danielle Maillard.
Good afternoon. My name is Danielle Maillard. I'm speaking today on behalf of Sunrise PDX along Anna and Paxton to advocate for the passing of the shelter to housing continuum, and particularly the passage of the amendments introduced by Portland Neighbors Welcome. I support each amendment, but I'm here to speak specifically about the amendment to not undermine existing vehicle dwellings. The shelter to housing continuum creates new, legal, stable options on residential private property. This legalization empowers those with the adequate resources to create housing opportunities for their neighbors who are on the verge of eviction or already houseless. This being said, a foundational reason for the legalization of these dwellings is that it is a solution to getting a roof over the heads of those who cannot afford it. Therefore, adding language that requires these dwellings to have $10,000 to $20,000 sewer connections is a barrier of entry and would make many adequate existing dwellings illegal. I urge you to adopt this amendment so the people benefiting from these vehicle dwellings will actually have the opportunity to make a living without the burden of an expensive sewage connection requirement. We have the resources to adopt alternative sanitation solutions, such as established dumping sites, mobile street teams, or pumping services, and we've seen cities such as Eugene answer to this call for action. It's mind-blowing to me that people care so much about where exactly their houseless neighbors decide to live, but couldn't seem to care less whether these same people actually live or die. I'm 23, and on this very day last year, literally like this same exact time, I was laid off from all 3 of my jobs because of COVID. I had to move out of my apartment in Northeast because I could no longer afford rent. Fortunately, I have family and friends who are more than happy to support me. We don't shame the people in our own lives for not having options and needing help. We do everything in our power to help them. This mentality can't stop with the people we know and love. I truly hope anybody testifying in opposition of this policy today is in the process of personally housing the people who live in the tents they're complaining about, or donating to the mutual aid funds that have existed as the only saving grace for people on the verge of eviction. The passage of this policy and noted amendments is critical. Thank you for your time.
Next up, we have Robert Schultz.
Hi there. I wish you had pictures. Hope everybody's doing great. Buckle up, I'm going to talk fast. I'm Robert Schultz, a full-time single father of 3 in Southeast Portland. I object to the proposals as presented for several reasons, but I'll just stick with a few because I get 2 minutes. $1.8 billion spent on housing in 6 years for what has been regularly described as 6,500 people on the street. That's failing by any measure that I'm aware of, and yet we see no audit, we see no level of accountability, and we being the public. Secondly, a lack of community input, which is a vital issue and one I'll speak on a little bit now. As an example of the touted outreach noted by city staff and some of the problems within our system, I learned of this proposal at a Lents Neighborhood Association meeting that was attended by 12 people. Lents has 22,000 residents. So that's how invested their outreach was, 12 people. The Lents Neighborhood Association has a 3-year history of discrimination and bigotry. It has an even longer history of being used as a resume builder rather than advocating for or engaging with the Lents community. Yet the city staff tout this as an engagement, that this is meaningful. What really happened in that meeting? Mr. Engstrom gave us notice that a decision had been made. He clearly noted that if anybody wanted to give feedback, his group was done listening. We never heard him ask to hear our voice. We had no opportunity for him to listen. So at the first mention of this plan, there was no opportunity for input. This is normal when the city Portland comes to Lents. I would like to suggest that when an issue impacts the entire city and disproportionately impacts Southeast Portland, outreach engagement should be robust and a focus should be seen with regard to the most impacted areas. Why is engagement so hard to ask for? I can literally do better in 1 week than what has been seen in the last 5 years by well-paid city staff that are often entirely unimpacted by proposals they plan in place in front of you, and that takes them 10 or 20 minutes while we, the community, get 2. I have a little bit more. Can I get 5 more seconds? The proposed action is telling the city that pooping in a tent on the side of the road while rats drag away your food is an acceptable living condition. It tells our youth of Portland that you should only aspire to live in a tent or a shack enshrouded by trash. This says that after spending $1.8 billion in the last 6 years, the city is giving up on housing solutions. We need you folks to allow people like me and my neighbors, both housed and houseless, to present you with our creative solutions that could be then implemented. We don't have that avenue right now. So you guys are missing a bulk of creative problem solving because we have no agency, we have no voice. The entrusted city staffers don't listen to us, they come and tell us. So you miss out when we get to these listening sessions, you miss out on a bulk of good information from housed and houseless alike. And I apologize for going over. I know Miss Hardesty really hates that. I apologize specifically because I know that's an irritation. I appreciate your tolerance, everybody. Thanks for hearing me.
Next up, we have Jim Owens, Peter Fry, and Ginger Edwards. Jim, are you able to unmute? Right. Why don't we go to Peter Fry?
Hi.
Peter, there's some sort of a strange echo there. I don't know what's causing it. Do you have more than one microphone on?
Peter, do you want to try to unmute?
Okay, let me try again. Peter Finley Fry. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, that's much better. Thank you.
Okay, I apologize. This is a significant piece of work. I'm a land use planner. I've been involved in these issues now for almost 40 years. This is much more than shelters. Although that's what your focusing is on, it talks about the entire definition of a housing unit. In fact, I'm working on a very large project that benefits from your redefinition of group living, for example, and provisions of services that can be provided to housing without having to go through a land use approval. There was a reason why shelters were conditional uses They were poorly managed, and I've seen some horrible ones. And they were concentrated in areas of poverty like the Mission, the Cabrini Green, East Portland. And so I asked the city council request annual reports every year to look at where are the shelters being developed and how they are being developed to ensure there's equity. Shelter is not housing. I have heard a lot of confusion about that today. A shelter is a place for a temporary respite, a place for safety, security, to connect, to be able to get your act together, figure out or find out how people can help you do that. It requires intervention on a personal level. I hear a lot of talk about housing being the cause of homelessness. That is not my opinion. My opinion is homelessness is caused because people do not get along very well. Families split apart, divorces, etc. We do not have very good mechanisms to deal with each other on a very personal level. And I am glad that the mayor and others are forcing the personal touch with the new street response services and things of that sort. I appreciate your direction. Thank you.
Let's try Jim Owens.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
My apologies for my technical incompetencies. Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, council members. I'm Jim Owens. I'm a retired member of the Portland Parks Board and the Portland Parks Foundation Board. I want to start by applauding the efforts of BPS and its partners in bringing the recommendations to you today. I'd intended to speak about some concerns with the definition of temporary with respect to open spaces and parks, but a number of others have and will speak to that. Instead, I'd like to read a letter from Kathy Fong Stevens, who's a former fellow board member and former chair of the Portland Parks Board. And I'm going to be brief with this. These are Kathy's comments. My brief comments today focus on a small but important portion of the shelter to housing continuum draft documents and proposed code changes. That is the inclusion of Portland's open space zones in the inventory of land for potential siting of temporary outdoor shelters. Others testifying have spoken to and will speak to the misleading term temporary in this context. Others have cited and will cite the negative impacts on our parks and open spaces. But I have another personal reason for urging you to disallow outdoor shelters in parks and open spaces, and why I do not believe that this would contribute meaningfully to a well-planned sheltered housing continuum. Just after the start of this year, two people that I know well ended their lives at an encampment near the river. One, a very young man, had spent the past few years battling addiction and mental health issues. The other, his father, had been in stable housing and services for the whole time I knew him, but unfortunately got entangled in the encampment living situation. I tell you about this tragedy to remind you that there is a spectrum of unsheltered people, and among that spectrum, there are those whose needs go well beyond basic hygiene stations and food distribution. Effectively meeting these needs will take more than just good intentions and the seemingly simple action of sanctioning encampments in our parks and open space. The word compassion comes up a lot when Portlanders talk about addressing the needs of those experiencing homelessness. I believe the compassionate Portlanders sincerely want shelter options to succeed. We want effective options that will support people to progress along the continuum. Simply allowing the sanctioning of encampments, however temporary, in our parks and open spaces does not well serve those in need of shelter or our community members who need safe access to parks, open space, and pathways. Thank you on Kathy's behalf and mine.
Next up, we have Ginger Edwards. Ginger, are you able to unmute? We can call the next three and then check back in with Ginger. Next up, we have Tiffany Johnson, Heather Flint Chado, Paul Niedergang.
Oh, what did I do? Oh, uh-oh.
Tiffany?
Is it me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I'm not used to the virtual where I don't have a video to see myself. So thank you for your time. I don't see the timer yet, but I'm going to get started. My name is Tiffany Johnson, and I'm testifying on behalf of the Mount Scott Arletta Neighborhood Association. We'd like to provide our conditional support of this project. Specifically, we agree with the recommendations of the Portland Neighborhoods Welcome and Shelter PDX, and we strongly encourage adoption of their recommendations. We want to specifically say that the city should stop classifying households based on familial relationship, that should not be considered, and that all neighborhoods shall accept the diversity of housing options such as shelters and villages, and that shouldn't be just concentrated in Southeast, that we all need to share some of the responsibility to taking care of all of the community members. We also want to state that the city should allow group living by right in existing residential structures of any kind in low density zones, increase the number of sleeping rooms allowed without triggering group home living categories, avoid counting occupied RVs against the number of ADUs allowed on a site, allow far more beds in indoor shelter and far more accommodations per outdoor shelters, relax the conditional use review requirements for shelters. A lot of people gave good testimony about that earlier, about why conditional uses may be prohibited for certain people to go through the process to provide additional housing. We'd like to say include RVs, tiny houses on wheels, and other types of shelters as allowed for outdoor shelter. And although, well, I'll just, I guess since my time is almost up, we'd like the city to possibly look at what the city of Eugene has done for overnight parking program, which allows general vehicle dwelling permitting program. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Next up, we have Heather Flint Chato.
Hi there. Before you start my timer, I'm wondering if I might be able to share my slides.
Yes, let me make a quick. Heather, you should be able to share your screen.
Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Heather Flint Chato. I'm an urban planner and environmental designer, and I am here representing the Art Farm Tiny House Artist Eco Village. It's a client design project of mine, and also here representing several amendments in which we've shared with some of the council. This is a replicable model that we've created, or at least an attempt to create a model for adapting an existing developed site that is underdeveloped with a single family house, but is zoned for multifamily. We have, excuse me, we have, trying to click between my slides and it's not working, sorry. We have many benefits of tiny houses on wheels that we'd like to support. So I'm going to click through those, both for its tiny house, climate benefits, and other affordability aspects. There is an existing tiny house on our property with a composting toilet, and there are other benefits associated with this that we think could allow more affordability if we were to waive these connection requirements for more off-grid living. Further, we would like to propose an innovative housing demonstrations pilot program, which would allow for a variety of different environmentally oriented, climate responsive, and affordable social housing types that are not available now, and in a way that could allow a small number of demonstration projects with low risk, and that's based on a precedent from the city of Redmond. So this is a different sort of model, but the framework is there. And this could address things like zero energy buildings or zero waste buildings, community land trusts and co-housing, as well as equitable food-oriented development. So I don't have enough time to talk to you about all of those, but we have lots of examples in our slide set that you can look at to see more kind of mini case studies. And, particularly food-oriented development, I think would be a wonderful model as an alternative to transit-oriented development, and would allow for more projects that have not even been considered yet, like for example, the LA Dome Village, which I was able to visit many years ago, but could allow Portland to be a leader in further innovation. Thank you. And I would pass this on to Paul Niedergang if you are ready for him. Happy to talk to commissioners on any of these if they're interested.
Hello, Mayor Wheeler and commissioners. My name is Paul Niedergang. I've lived in Portland since 1975 and have a small real estate development company called Progressive Development Group. I strongly support the sheltered housing continuum. The city of Portland declared a housing emergency in 2015. In many ways, the crisis has only worsened since then. So it is crucial that we encourage greater innovation to address the crisis. To help unleash the power of the greater Portland community, I strongly recommend that the Sheltered Housing Continuum Project incorporate an innovative housing demonstration pathway as part of the code update. This would allow a limited number of pilot projects to demonstrate the viability of alternative options. We've been working on developing an affordable tiny home village on a 20,000 square foot RM1 site in Southeast Portland that we acquired in 2017. The concept is a nonprofit arts-focused tiny home eco-village called Art Farm. The site came with a house, workshop, and barn, and we have since added one tiny home. Despite our best efforts, we've been unable to figure out a permitting path for the concept. The idea behind Art Farm is to demonstrate the viability of one alternative development model with the hope that other people will replicate and refine the model. The project arose out of the realization that over the past decade, many artists have been displaced from their workspaces and have also found themselves priced out of the housing market. If we want to have art in our community, we need to have affordable spaces for artists to live and work. Our proposed design would allow for up to 10 tiny homes with a common kitchen and restroom facilities. The proposed shelter to housing code revisions bring this type of development closer to reality, but there are still issues that need to be resolved. We need to eliminate or modify the 25-foot setback requirement. It would be ideal to create a by right expedited pathway for tiny home village clusters that does not require conditional use. A type 3 review is lengthy and costly and creates greater uncertainty, which may deter these types of housing projects. Secondly, allow an off-grid option by eliminating the requirement for utility hookups. I encourage you to make additional changes to the Shelter to Housing Continuum project to enable permitted projects of this nature to be built. And I really appreciate all the work that's gone into it by staff up to this point. Thank you all.
Next up is Ginger Edwards.
Hi, thank you for coming back to me. I'm sorry I didn't figure out to unmute earlier. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, Mayor Wheeler and commissioners. My name is Ginger Edwards. I am the volunteer facilitator of the North Portland Advisory Group. I come to you today, as several others before me have, to ask for a very small change, I believe, in this amazing set of code changes. The change that I'm asking for is that parks, trails, natural areas, and golf courses be removed from the definition of open spaces allowed for temporary shelters. Why is that? Because parks belong to all of us in Portland, the housed and the unhoused. Parks provide that pressure release valve for all of us. It's a place to play, a place to take a walk, a place to rest, a place to meet friends, maybe a place to sit down against a tree and just appreciate the beauty of where you're at and relax for a few minutes. The concern that we have as the North Portland Parks Advisory Group is that we're hearing from neighbors that if 180-day temporary shelters are placed in parks, that parents are telling us they won't feel comfortable bringing their children to the playground. Seniors are telling us they won't feel safe taking a walk. Personally, I feel sad that that's their response, but that is the response that they are telling me. And so I have to accept that that is their real feeling. I am one of those people who takes food to homeless people weekly. And so obviously I'm not afraid of that, but others are. Anyway, we ask that you take out parks, trails, natural areas, and golf courses. But we applaud your efforts for this very complicated, very comprehensive plan to provide shelter for all of the people who live in Portland. Thank you.
Next up, we have Mac Cunningham, Michael Anderson, and Candace Avalos.
Hello, should I go first? This is Candace.
Mac, are you able to unmute?
Yes, now I am. Thank you so much. Sorry about that. Hello, all. My name is Matt Cunningham. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify before you all today. I would like to implore you all to please pass the shelter to housing continuum. I would also strongly encourage you to pass the amendments as have been proposed by Portland Neighbors Welcome. The previous council before this one has made great strides in Portland to legalizing more affordable housing types for middle-income households. I now encourage you all to please continue to do the same, but for lower income households in our community, as well as for our neighbors who are experiencing homelessness. Ending our housing crisis, which has been in state since 2015, longer than our current mayor has even been the mayor, will require building more housing and building more affordable housing types. While this project alone will not build more housing directly, it will increase the amount of housing types that can be built, and it also shows greater empathy for our neighbors who are currently experiencing homelessness. Thank you all for your time. Once again, I would strongly implore you to pass this package. Thank you again.
Next up, we have Michael Anderson.
Hey, thank you, Council. My name is Michael Anderson. I'm a senior researcher with Sightline Institute. We're a regional sustainability think tank. I'll be very brief. I'm speaking in support of the project with the recommended amendments from Portland Neighbors Welcome and the Social Justice Coalition, as well as those of the PDX Shelter Forum. I want to raise two quick substantive points. First, I don't fully understand the city's feeling about front yards in this project. I don't see the argument against allowing a home on wheels in front of the main house. Second, golf courses are pleasant, but they are not parks and they're not natural. And honestly, they need not be public. They might be viable land to look at in this project or future ones while we protect other parks and natural areas. Finally, one caveat to the whole enterprise: legalizing ways for very poor people to live comfortably, more comfortably, doesn't eliminate poverty, and neither does banning the ways poor people can live more comfortably. The best approach is to make it legal for people to live more comfortably without harming others, and simultaneously working to eliminate poverty by boosting people's incomes through job access, direct payments, anything else we can do for them. Thank you.
Next up is Candace Avalos.
Good afternoon, Mayor and City Commissioners. My name is Candace Avalos. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a Black teen millennial renting in Northeast Portland, and I'm here to voice my strong support for the shelter to housing continuum. The overall goal of this project to make more low barrier, entry-level, temporary shelter available to more people experiencing houselessness is something we should all support if we're serious about coming out of this pandemic better than we were before it started. You have heard many compelling reasons for supporting this from advocacy organizations like Portland Neighbors Welcome and Street Roots, as well as heartbreaking stories directly from our houseless neighbors. So I won't take up too much more time other than to reemphasize three specific points. First and foremost, the only way you get people off the street is with safe places to live, period. That means we need more shelter options. Second, the Planning and Sustainability Commission has proposed good shelter and housing options, and the City Council should not backtrack on any of them. And lastly, City Council should maximize the city's ability to use the options proposed by the Planning and Sustainability Commission by adopting the amendments from Portland Neighbors Welcome, such as extending the housing emergency and allowing sanctioned outdoor shelters in appropriate approved sites in open space zones and in the right of way. Our houseless neighbors deserve better, and it is the City Council's responsibility to do everything in their power to give them a realistic path towards becoming housed instead of continuing to push the problem down the road. Approving the Shelter to Housing Continuum project is within your power, and we are demanding that you use it. Thank you.
Next up, we have Donna Cohen, Jay Katja, and Oak Alger.
Great. Hello. Good afternoon, Council. My name is Donna Cohen, and I live in St. John's. I'm so pleased and proud of my city to see the efforts that you're making to deal with the crises of affordable housing and houselessness. First, please extend the housing state of emergency. If we're not in an emergency now, I don't know what would qualify. Second, as we know, zoning restrictions make it harder to respond to the need for housing options. Please, accept the changes that the Planning and Sustainability Bureau has proposed. Specifically, I support expanding the locations for siting sanctioned outdoor shelters to many available open spaces throughout the city. I know there is contention about parks land. Although I believe we can mostly avoid using parks, I also think that some of our parks are quite large enough that a small slice can be tapped off for this important use. I happen to live in an affordable housing development that, before it was built, was protested by neighbors because they wanted to continue to walk their dogs among the prior existing undeveloped park here. No matter that a quarter of a mile away, there was another much larger park. No matter that 115 families would be able to purchase their first homes because of the conversion of their dog walk area. Sometimes we just have trouble seeing beyond our own needs, especially when it comes to responding to others in need of housing, it seems like. For some locations, we should not require traditional water sewer connections where we or residents can provide alternatives, such as with RVs or city-provided sanitary facilities. I think about the safe parking program in Los Angeles, where folks can park their cars or trailers safely overnight at a guarded location with sanitary amenities. A simple place to park one's car and not be hassled can do a lot for a decent night's sleep. Please continue to push the envelope. Thank you so much for what you're doing.
Next up, we have Jay Katja.
Hi, my name is Jay Chachka. I work in the homeless youth continuum for the past 7 years, and I'm also a resident of Southeast Portland. Thanks for this time to speak. Shelters are obviously needed, and I also agree with the tent camp idea, but I also see that they're not the solution. Many of my clients that I work with do not want to go to shelter, and there's only one youth shelter in town anyway. They don't feel safe. So that's an issue that I have to work around with a lot of them. There needs to be, in my opinion, I'm glad we brought up and heard about the group living proposal. I think that's very important. I think there needs to be more group housing like Bridge House and New Doors, places like Unity, and especially culturally specific houses that have say 7-8 people, run by places like NEA or SEI or Latino Network. And I think they need to be spread out throughout the city. I think the other thing that's been surprising to me is through this, I haven't heard anything about addiction and homelessness and addiction. While obviously not everybody who's homeless is addicted, they are two issues that feed each other. And I think if we really want to get the homeless issue solved, we also have to include addiction treatments as well as mental health treatments. We can't do that with, they can't be separated. We need to figure out strong ways to do both. And if people don't want treatment and are unwilling to get the help they need, we also have to be tough and not allow those people to run through our city. So, rights without responsibility doesn't work. Everybody has to take responsibility. So that's what I have to say. Thank you for your time.
Next up, we have Oak Alger.
Hi there, my name is Oak Alger.
I'm sorry for one. I apologize. One second. Keelan, after this testimony, could you give us some sense of how many folks are left? I just want to do a time check.
Yes, I will.
All right. Sorry, Oak.
My name is Oak Alger. My pronouns are he, his. I'm here today to voice my support for the shelter to housing continuum. And as well, I want to support the actions and amendments proposed by Portland Neighbors Welcome. The housing emergency needs to be extended. I think it's clear that the work isn't done. Maybe the work hasn't been done, depending on who you ask. I also want to say that we should allow sanctioned outdoor shelters in appropriate and approved sites, the open space zones, and in the right of way. There's a lot of talk about the parks, the golf courses. If you ask me, we already allow camping at a lot of places in this state that we consider to be natural gems. We have lots of campsites around the state, and people are able to camp there, and they're expected to keep them clean. And I understand that in people's minds, you think of recreational camping and camping to survive as different. But if you can camp recreationally in a park, why can't you camp to survive in a park, is what I would say to that. On top of that, I like what's in this bill, or this amendment, or whatever you want to call it. The issue that I have is that what you're creating these sanctioned shelters and sanctioned places where people can go and live and get the resources that they should have, because housing is a human right, and so is access to addiction services and stuff like that. But the issue is that you have to understand that there's going to be a reluctance from people to trust the city after they've been swept and harassed and brutalized. 50% of Portland cops' use of force incidents have been against houseless people. So you have to understand there's a lack of trust in the institution. So how do you create that bond? How do you create that trust so people will come and stay in your campsites and trust that their tiny homes will be able to stay there and that this will actually work? Because what I'm hearing is I would have a hard time trusting that. I don't understand how you're going to say to people, we're going to support you, we're going to take care of you, when you're not doing it right now. All this stuff that's going to happen is future stuff. We need action right now, and we need to create trust that when this stuff passes and is finished, people are willing to go there and are willing to do the stuff, because you're asking a lot. You're asking a lot of people to go and trust you. So you have to build that trust starting now. Thank you for your time.
Mayor, I'm showing we have about 43 testifiers remaining.
Very good. Thank you.
Next up, we have Madeline Hotchkiss, Sarah Carolus, and Amanda Fritz.
Hello, my name is Madeline Hotchkiss. I'm speaking in full support of the proposed shelter to housing continuum project. I also urge the City Council to extend the housing state of emergency and consider the amendments proposed by Portland Neighbors Welcome, namely allowing sanctioned outdoor shelters in appropriate approved sites in open space zones and in the right of way, and dropping the requirement for vehicles to have costly sewer connections. Recently, I discovered that the Joint Office of Homeless Services, on behalf of the City of Portland and Multnomah County, is seeking proposals for alternative shelters to assist those experiencing unsheltered homelessness. While I think this is a wonderful idea, it will not reach its full potential without first passing the Shelter to Housing Continuum project. We can have many innovative, fantastic ideas for shelters and alternative shelters in villages, etc., but without having places to locate them, it will all be for naught. Let's not have a zoning code get in the way of our creativity of our community. Let's pass the Shelter to Housing Continuum project and let our city code be part of the solution rather than the problem. So please pass the Shelter to Housing Continuum project and extend the housing state of emergency. Thank you.
Next up, we have Sarah Carolus.
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Carolus. I strongly support adopting the zoning code changes in the Shelter to Housing Continuum. I'm co-chair of the advocacy team of the Interfaith Alliance on Poverty, an organization of faith congregations. We feel that passing these code changes will offer a chance for stability, a place of transition off the streets, and a better quality of life for our unhoused. We applaud the proposed increase and diversity of shelter options. Congregate shelter does not work for everyone. Affordable housing buildings take years to build. Having a wide range of alternative options fitting multiple situations is a great step forward for Portland. In addition to supporting the Title 33 zoning changes, I also support removing restrictions on tiny houses on wheels and RVs included in Title 29, especially the requirement for water and sewage connection, which is extremely prohibitive. In the past days, I've been reading the public testimony about this proposal and acknowledge significant public opinion against it. I feel that these opinions are ill-informed and misguided, and I find abhorrent a common thread of demonization of the unhoused. I support, however, an amendment that would permit right-of-way land for outdoor shelter use to help increase potential sites. I believe exclusions of specific sites of sensitive natural areas and hiking areas, recreational public areas would be specific, but would allow unspecific, unused open space land for outdoor shelters and would just address public concerns. Thank you very much for your time and your consideration. Please keep in front of you the goal of reducing houselessness in humane and productive ways. Thank you.
Next up, we have Amanda Fritz.
Wait a minute. Here we go. Sorry. Good afternoon, Councillor Amanda Fritz. I support almost everything in this packet. I particularly appreciate, the making things standard that have previously been conditional uses or not allowed. I also appreciate the testimony of Portland Neighbours Welcome. I don't think that RVs on private property should have sewer hookups or even campground standards. Residents who allow people to live in an RV on their property will make sure that the wastewater is either pumped or driven for disposal at free roadside hookups that are available in Portland. And also, I think you should allow people to live in RVs in the front setback if that's where that RV happens to be. I am very concerned about the use of parks, particularly since the mayor and I worked really hard to pass the levy in November. The levy summary said that the purpose of the levy will prevent ongoing reductions to park services and recreational programs, preserve and restore park and natural area health, and center equity and affordable access for all. And it talked about protecting water quality, wildlife habitat, and natural areas. And Mayor Wheeler's statement said, in the midst of a pandemic and economic challenges, we've seen the use of our parks increase, a reminder of the critical role parks and open spaces play in our lives and communities. As mayor, I'm committed to make sure that these gems in our city remain a resource for all of us. And there's a very simple solution to the challenges. And I realize I'm running out of time. I've sent in some more testimony and I already sent in some. You can prohibit even temporary outdoor shelters on properties owned by Portland Parks and Recreation, the Water Bureau, and Environmental Services. And this obviously wouldn't it's so distracting to see the countdown clock. Sorry. This wouldn't apply to temporary shelters in community centres. I do encourage you to ask Parks Director Adina Long to testify at the next meeting. She's been a really great partner in setting up the community centre shelters. And I also have some concerns about what Kimberly Talent talked about with the visibility standards. It looks like they actually restrict the ability to build ADUs and to do internal conversions, which I don't believe is the intent of this policy. Thank you for letting me go over a little bit.
Thank you, Commissioner Fritz, and it's great to hear from you again.
Next up, we have James Sulin, Gwen Luta, and Joe Petrina.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Jim Shalin. Mayor Wheeler and City Council, thank you for considering our testimony on the issue of accommodating our city's houseless citizens in Portland's parks. I worked for Portland Parks and Recreation for nearly 30 years. For a large part of my career, I was a manager of Portland Parks Natural Areas and Trails. Early on, I was a field supervisor for parks in inner Southeast and Northeast Portland. As all know, in terms of land uses, public rights of way and Portland parks are feeling the brunt of the impacts from our homeless crisis. I am pleased to see that the permanent shelters in Portland parks are not being recommended currently. However, temporary shelters allowed to be in place for up to 360 consecutive days are on the table for parks. If allowed in the open space zone, Portland parks will surely become a focal point of our houseless crisis. I am concerned for the displacement of other park uses, for the impacts to facilities and landscapes never designed to withstand the stress of temporary housing, for the additional burdens on park staff, and for the ability of our parks to recover afterwards. I personally have had to deal with the impacts in the aftermath of camps in Portland parks and along public trails. The impacts are devastating financially, and for years afterwards, devastating to our public landscapes. The proposal would put the Director of Parks and the Parks Commissioner in the very difficult position of deciding which park should accommodate sanctioned shelters. And what a tumble for Portland parks, only 12 years ago recognized as the nation's finest urban park system. Conversion of parkland away from park use is a betrayal of public trust. As heartbreaking as the houseless crisis is, I know that I am joined by thousands of Portlanders with the same concerns and feelings. I support the rest of all the other recommendations, including in shelter to housing. Thank you.
Next up, we have Gwen Luta.
Good afternoon, members of the Portland City Council. I'm really impressed with your patience, and thank you for giving me 2 minutes. I have scrapped pages of what I would like to say, but this is the essence of it. I am in favor of relaxing zoning to accommodate more short-term sheltering options to get people out of tents and cars and off the streets while we are building real affordable housing. Houselessness is costing us a lot of money. Let's find solutions and keep Portland beautiful. I really would like to support what Kaya said. She's the executive director of Roots. I don't even know her, but I've read a lot of what she says. I think she's right on. She's there. She's in the middle of it. I'm not. I live in the South Waterfront area. But I'm so impressed with the knowledge of all the people that have spoken today. I'm just really impressed with Portland, how we participate. Thank you.
Next up, we have Joe Petrina.
Yeah, good afternoon on this beautiful sunny day. My name is Joe Petrina, and I'm a rare native Portlander. I want to thank all of the council and the staffers for all of your hard work. You have a job that is certainly difficult and complex, and with the pandemic has even made it more troubling. This measure is probably greatly misunderstood, probably because it's complicated. Clearly, the Portland homeless population needs our help. They need social programs. They need suitable housing. And I don't believe they need tents. They need potential jobs. They need drug counseling. They need permanent shelters for those who can't work. My dog decided to join us here. Sorry about that. We have just voted for the Metro tax funding of $250 million to help cover the homeless services. And let's hope these funds are used effectively, targeted for homeless housing, counseling, and cleanup. I want to strongly urge the council to amend the shelter housing measure to exclude open spaces. Many of the testimonies today have already made cases for excluding parks, golf courses, and other open spaces, for we have enough suitable housing stock without including open spaces. Otherwise, I'm in full agreement with S2HC. Just wanted to let the council know of a couple of my frustrations. You know, I've lived here all my life. I'm just kind of disappointed the way things have gone, but I understand the complexities. You know, I've considered moving out, but I really don't want to move out. This is my home. I've lived here all my life. I just want to make a couple of points. You know, a friend of mine lives up by Forest Park, and she's been accosted a couple of times by homeless people, one naked that threatened to kill her and her dog, which it was probably just an idle threat, but it was still scary. And she said there's been fires and so on and so forth. So I'm going to try and sum this up. I just want to say, let's do the right thing for the citizens of Portland. Amend this shelter measure, removing parks and golf courses. Thank you.
The next three we have are Paul Souders, Mimi German, and Fiona Burgess.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, yes, good afternoon. My name is Paul Souders. I live in Southeast Portland. I've already provided written testimony in favor of the project with the amendments proposed by Portland Neighbors Welcome. I'd like to support that testimony with a personal story. Last week, a friend's father died of pneumonia. He was living in an RV sited illegally on a private lot owned by his employer without access to water or sanitation and only occasional access to electricity. So he actually paid rent for this privilege. So it was an illegal lot and an illegally sited RV, but he was paying money to live this way. His life situation, his legal situation was such that he didn't have a lot of housing options or employment options for that matter, and he was therefore easy prey to an unscrupulous landlord. When we cleaned out his RV, it was a disaster because he couldn't wash clothes or dishes or flush away waste. He was like literally living in filth, like literal filth. It was not surprising that he had died really swiftly of fungal pneumonia, a preventable disease. If he had lived in a tiny house, or if his RV had been sited in a place like a church parking lot or on a private lot with a flexible sanitation solution, like not necessarily a sewer hookup, but just some way to dispose of waste, he would probably be alive. So I appreciate the council's efforts to provide many varied solutions for sheltering and housing our neighbors, and I think we should take it farther with even more flexibility for future city councils. And on a completely separate note, I'd like to add that I wonder a little bit about our obsession with golf courses in particular, why those of all natural areas need to be protected, especially in an emergency. As Michael Anderson said earlier, they're not particularly natural places. So anyway, thank you for listening. I appreciate you. Thanks.
Next up, we have Mimi German.
Hi, this is Mimi German. I'm an advocate in St. John's for our houseless community, and I've been doing that work as a volunteer and somebody who I consider myself a sister to the folks on our street, and that they are my extended family. The question that I have regarding all of this is, why is the city not trusting those of us who have the trust from the people on the street? I don't work for any nonprofit. I don't want to work for a nonprofit. I don't see any reason to work for a nonprofit when I can do exactly as I've done for 5 years for the people, knowing that they do get what they need, not just from me, I don't mean it like that, but with my help. We didn't have toilets out here until I had to harass the city, especially during COVID, to the point of shutting down city council to get toilets out here, especially during COVID. The city never even responded to our plead for sanitizing stations during COVID. It was Sarah Ionaron who came out to help me with sanitizing stations for our people in St. John's. So the question that I have is, when we know, those of us who advocate on the street directly with the people almost every day, that we are the ones who people call when they need to go to the hospital. They call when maybe somebody's really sick. They call when there's going to be a sweep. They call when, whatever it is happens, when the cops are there unmasked. I'm the one who gets called, at least in my neighborhood. So why, when I work with my extended family to create positive shelter for them, like Jason Barnes Landing, with toilets paid for a year, with trash pickup, why do we get swept? Why do we get beaten down by the city when what we're doing is everything you are trying to do for no money for no obligation from the city to even help, including wraparound services. We've had, I alone with my friends out there, with in cooperation with Northwest Pilot Project, have had 6 people housed in the last year and a half. So my question is that, it's not even, it's a statement. I would like in this, whatever it is that you're doing, this bill, whatever it's called, ordinance, whatever, I would like there to be some form of way to communicate with those of us who actually have some immediate answers and are putting things on the ground to do exactly as you are asking in that ordinance. Thanks for your time.
Next up, we have Fiona Burgess.
Yes, hi there. Thank you. For the record, my name is Fiona Burgess. I live in Southwest Portland, about 5 miles away from downtown. I'd love to see more options for houseless folks in my neighborhood. I know my neck of the woods isn't exactly the first place you'd think of when you think of homelessness. And I know that there is certainly a greater concentration of unhoused people on the east side. I'm supportive of bringing these people aid where they're at. So I understand why providers are likely to focus on the east side. I support it. The fact of the matter is that people are losing everything everywhere, and the lack of shelter resources combined with virtually no public restrooms and regular harassment from wealthy home and business owners has made it all the more difficult for those unfortunate enough to be stuck down here. I keep running across people sleeping in abandoned parking lots without even a blanket to protect them, and I'm sick and tired of it. This is part of why I'm hoping that this proposal will implement the recommendations of Portland Neighbors Welcome, in particular, this allowance of sanctioned shelters and open space zones and the right of way. And I'm not talking about parks at all. Many camps and sanctioned shelters already exist in open spaces with no trouble, such as the area underneath Morrison's Bridge, the grassy ditches along southwest of Terwilliger, and as a few people have mentioned up to this point, Right to Dream too. These are neither sensitive natural areas nor parks, and you'll find more and more areas like this further west. The further west you go, you'll find more and more of these areas. Open spaces, abandoned lots, and other areas that are too disturbed to be considered parks, but far enough away from major pollution sites to provide a safe place to reside. It'd be a tremendous